I looked at AI completely differently from neural networks. Everyone's obsessed with neural networks. Voltaire had a phrase, had a saying: "If it's true that God created man in his own image, man has certainly returned the compliment." And something analogous could be said about AI. We seem determined to build AI that looks like a human brain, and I have never understood why that's a good idea.
So just spend a couple of minutes deconstructing that.
Right.
The sort of the thinking behind why maybe people see that as the only way, and then your differing ideas.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's partly an engineering mindset of incremental improvement. So you've got to start off with something that you know thinks.
This should be a baseline.
Yeah. And it's like, well, the human brain evidently thinks. It's composed of neurons. So we're going to build AI. Let's build it based on simulated neurons.
Welcome to the Global Affair podcast, brought to you by Love Out Loud, the world's largest love-based movement, actualizing a civilization of love by 2030. My name's Nicole Gibson, and join me and some of the world's brightest minds as we bring some of the most important and controversial conversations of our time into a space of unity. It's important to know that as your host, this isn't about my personal opinion or bias, but rather an opportunity to listen with love, honesty, curiosity, and reveal the true universal experience us humans have amongst the differences. So if you love the show, please let us know by giving us a rating and tell us how to make this conversation easier for other people to jump into as well. And with that, let's get it.
So Nigel, thank you so much for coming and hanging out.
My pleasure, Nicole.
So when you and I met, what captivated me, other than your amazing talk about the incredible work you're doing in AI, was the conversation we had around culturescape, your passion for, or what I saw as passion for extracting, the DNA of what makes humans do what they do. And, without taking the conversation today in too many directions, I'd love to go back to that innate curiosity. Well, is it innate?
Oh, yes.
Is it, and what that was like for you in the very beginning and how that led to the work that you're doing today.
Wow, that's a huge question.
Yeah, I mean, we can just begin and then can go deeper as the conversation evolves.
Okay. Well, I'm not really sure how to answer that because that's such a big question. I think we need to break that down a bit.
Yeah. What was it like for you growing up with that curiosity?
It was interesting. I always was fascinated by why other people did things, why groups of people did what they did. I was studying at the University of Queensland. I was involved in things like student politics, which I took an interest in, almost a zoological interest in how other people were believing what they believed very passionately and were fighting about it and so on. And it was really interesting just sitting and watching. So yeah, I got involved in student politics, which is an amazing little sort of petri dish of human behavior.
Yeah.
And just studying motivations and why people do what they do. So I think some of my colleagues got a bit irritated because rather than fervently pushing a cause, I was sort of sitting back and watching them going, oh really? And why are you doing that exactly? So so that was fascinating. And then seeing how that obviously ties in. I guess to some extent ties in with things like AI, etc. In terms of why do humans do what they do. And then necessarily, do we actually want a machine operating like that?
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of people seem to want a generative AI that behaves like a human. I've never understood why. I think humans are both interesting and scary enough without having a machine that does exactly the same thing.
Excessive power sparse. Amplifying our difficulties.
Yes.
Yeah. And so back then, do you feel like you had sort of prominent beliefs around the world, or were you more perceptive?
I definitely have very strong beliefs around the world. Yes, always. I did also enjoy teasing other people about their beliefs on an ongoing basis. Not in any hopefully in any sort of unpleasant way, but just curious to see why people believe what they believe, and transitions in belief and so on. So that was all very interesting.
What have you noticed? Human motivation.
Oh, again, that's a very big question, potentially a bit too amorphous to really grapple with.
Going back to Nigel back at university, what were you noticing at that point? So I'd love to get a pulse on how your perspective on the world was really shaped during these times and experiences.
Right. I grew up in a political family.
Okay.
And I grew up in a wider family that was right across the political spectrum.
Left all the way through to right.
Yeah. So for example, my father. Complicated. So I had my father was he was a barrister, and then he went into politics, and he was a Liberal MP, and then his younger brother was a staunch Labour barrister. And my father's best friend, one of his best friends from childhood, was Gottfried's speechwriter, Friedenberg.
Yeah.
And we would get people from right across the political spectrum who were all sort of friends who'd wander in and out. And so I was used to a diverse spectrum of belief, and just assumed that was the natural order of things.
Yeah, interesting.
And then I went to university and discovered it is not the natural order of things, and how tribal people are is quite extraordinary. And I always used to believe that universities were there to try and break down that tribalism. I'm not so optimistic anymore, but that's what I used to believe, that universities were there to break down the tribalism and expose people to lots of different perspectives.
Oh, I mean, yeah, that they maybe do, but the filters and the students are seeing it through don't allow them to take on. You know, and I personally feel that's one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing in the world at the moment, is with ever-growing kind of culture of demand and the echo chambers that we're existing in. We've lost the ability to hear and the capacity to actually extend our perspective, to see the world through someone else's eyes, to tolerate, differences of belief.
Absolutely. I mean, historically, one of the really interesting dynamics that you see is throughout the centuries, you have radicals becoming conservatives and vice versa. And so you have Edmund Burke, who's the guy who actually came up with the concept of small c conservatism during the French Revolution, had been a radical in the British Parliament during the American Revolution. And so he'd gone from being really radical, like he was advocating independence of the American colonies when most of the Americans didn't want independence in the American colonies, and he was still pushing for that. And then basically the revolution went in the direction that suddenly what Burke was saying continues increasingly aligned. But the interesting thing was that other figures that were, in many respects, you would regard them as conservative, like the Prime Minister at the time, Pitt the Elder, actually was himself, in many respects, radical. So he was himself there going, you know what, the Americans are actually right. And so Pitt was very unhappy with the way events were going in the colonies. And then you have, for example, the Eureka Stockade. The Australian leader of the Eureka Stockade ended up a Tory, which is something not many people are aware of.
How do you explain this disparity?
Well, because they're both proper radicalism and proper conservatism, both sides of the one coin.
There's no open-mindedness in the extreme of it all.
Yeah, and so you have. Radicalism is about the need to change. Conservatism, as defined by Burke, is the importance of the status quo, not because the status quo is inherently a good thing, but because human society is organic. And so if, as Burke argued, if you cut down the trees, then you have to be sure that you've got new trees coming in their place, not desolation. And so to him, that was the real dynamic. And that's a dynamic you do see across the centuries. For example, the abolition of slavery was really interesting in the early 19th century in that William Wilberforce in the British Parliament. He knew Pitt the Younger because I think they're basically school friends. And Pitt the Younger was, again, he was a Tory who was then persuaded that slavery was inherently evil. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly he does this enormous pivot.
Yeah.
And you have it's quite funny, you get the Tories and the capital R radicals in the British Parliament joining forces. Mm. And then you have the Whigs who are mercantile, sort of stuck in the middle going, no, we're not happy about this. Mm. But you get these really interesting flips in ideology when you have open-minded people, basically who disagree about everything else, who then sit down and say, oh, actually, you're right, this is a bad idea, so let's do something about it. And it's that kind of cognitive willingness, cognitive agility, to say, hey, everything I've been doing up to now is wrong. So what do I do about that? And that is what is dying, I think, with the current sequestration of people's worldviews. Yeah. So people are becoming increasingly pigeonholed. Yeah. And you are we are all, as a world, I think that we're growing to lack the sophistication of saying, hey, I just...
The nuance. Yeah.
And so it's you have to wonder, just sitting and like reading the debates of the early 19th century, and they're remarkably sophisticated. And then you go, well, would we ever get a debate like that again? And at the moment, I'm afraid the prognosis is fairly gloomy because everyone is too busy defending their own particular patch.
Yeah, or just mindless.
Or they're just willing to take the narrative that was fed to them without analyzing, and and challenging.
100%. I could not agree more with that analysis. And I think it's one of the most important conversations for us to be having at the moment.
Yeah.
Is what is the path forward? Is there a path forward based on where we're at right now to support the capacity within the individuals in our society to have more independent thought, to be more sovereign in the way that they're showing up? And what are the biggest threats to that? And why is all of this happening?
You're asking me the question? Well, what's the base?
Perspective,
I think there is an inflexibility. I mean, we were talking about this briefly beforehand. I think the whole concept of safe spaces is a massive failure. Thought is not supposed to be safe. Thought is supposed to be dangerous. It's supposed to be invasive. It's supposed to be dangerous. I mean, to grow is to have all your barriers crumble or be shattered, and then say, hang on, each step is into a wider world, and some of it's scary. And I mean, the whole point of growing up, the whole point of adolescence and growing up, I think, is to become comfortable with saying, hang on, these were the boundaries of my world yesterday, and now let's push it back a bit further. And sometimes the boundaries exist for a good reason. You say, yeah, you know what, they stay. But a lot of the other time, it's a case of the boundaries are there for comfort or laziness or safety. And then that inherently should be pushed back a bit. And
or at least a willingness to question it.
Yeah. So what I mean, people say that the Enlightenment, the spirit of the Age of Enlightenment, was embodied by the preamble to the American Constitution, that we hold these things to be self-evident, blah, 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 blah. I would say a better description of the Enlightenment is that we hold no things to be self-evident.
Right.
And it's a case of, what
even is self-evidence?
Well, yeah, we could get into that, but I mean, the central point is, if an idea is good, it is defensible. So it's an ancient thread. It goes back to the ancient Greeks. If an idea is good, it is defensible. You don't conquer evil by attempting to cancel people. You take ideas and you challenge them and you argue against them, and that's the only way to. Well, I mean, if we believe that we are all inherently rational people, and we have a capacity to reason, then that is the capacity, the age of reason. The whole idea was to defeat autocracy and dictatorship by
antagonizing ideas.
Yes, the adversarial process.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, for example, the Westminster Parliament, that's what made it so radical compared with a lot of its contemporaries from, really effectively from 17th century onwards, was that both sides are valid, and you have thesis and
one's not.
thesis and antithesis. But then the point is if somebody goes off the deep end, then the point is it's not just the other side of the house that tell them they've gone off the deep end. It's their own colleagues who say, no, you've gone off the deep end.
Yeah.
And that's a process we seem to be losing because we seem to think that we can cancel. There's a painting, I've always wanted to get a copy of it. There's a painting taken during the French Revolution of the Royal Tennis Court. And it is a whole lot of revolutionaries. And they must have stood there for ages getting at least sketched. Yeah, painting being painted. It's not a photograph. But there's an extraordinary array of people all standing around. And there's Danton, there's Robespierre, there's Saint-Just, there's all sorts of people. And the really interesting thing is, within a couple of years, all but one of them are dead. And they're not dead because the king killed them. They're dead because they killed one another. And so it's a case of, these are guys who, from their own perspective at the time this painting was done, were convinced they're on the right side of history. And so all they had to do was overthrow the king and set up a better constitution and everything would be dandy. And then the really interesting thing is because
they were their own demise.
They were. And they executed one another. And I think there's one chap there who had the good sense to sort of run off to a monastery. He's the survivor. He's the survivor. But a fascinating dynamic with the French Revolution where it basically eats its own.
Yeah.
And that, I have a nasty feeling, unless we return to the actual ideals of the Enlightenment and the importance of discourse with people we disagree with, we'll end up reenacting that particular painting in terms of, a society that just destroys all of its leading figures because they're inconvenient.
Yeah, it's a stark picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love this idea that anything fundamentally good is defensible.
Yeah.
So it poses a few questions that I find myself thinking about, especially for a young generation that aren't necessarily learning to articulate. They're not learning to formulate their ideas and their thoughts. I think largely because of everything's become an emoji, for instance.
Yes.
There's a convenience to self-expression, which I think we're losing finesse. We're losing the ability to even structure our ideas in a way that is compelling and allows us to build a defense around what we believe is innately good.
Well, George Orwell, of course, warned about this in 1984 when he said, with the manipulation of language and what dictatorships want is to reduce language to the quacking of a duck. And if you want to stop people questioning dictatorship, you impoverish the language
100%.
so that they can't move outside the boundaries.
Everything becomes an acronym. It becomes, shortened. And I mean, how many words have we lost since, Shakespeare's time, Old English? A sentence is taking you, 3 to 5 times longer to finish, but there's something so important about that capacity to articulate oneself.
Yes, well, as I mentioned before, I occasionally sort of moonlight as a political writer as well as being a mathematician.
Was that inspired by observing all of the political dynamics?
Yeah, and I was a university debater, and occasionally at the World Championships, and it was really interesting even then, which is the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, seeing how orthodoxies were narrowing people's worldview.
You were noticing
already, yes.
Yeah.
But when I became a writer, I was over at Oxford for 6 months, and
to write.
To write, yes, to write. And so I used to haunt the Bodleian Library, which is a fabulous library. One of the really interesting things was, because it was a passion of mine, I just enjoyed doing it, reading books from the 17th and 18th centuries right through to what was then the end of the 20th. And the thing I found fascinating is, late 17th, early 18th century, everyone writes for a huge attention span. And so, anything worth saying is worth going through in detail. And then across the 19th century, you see this gradual reduction of the attention span, but it's still long. And then in the 20th century, it suddenly collapses. And so still in the first half of the 20th century.
Even pre, just the 1.3 second attention span, there was a decrease.
Yes.
What was the causation of that at that time?
Don't know for sure. I suspect
Television.
Television is certainly one aspect, and public entertainment.
Yeah.
Well, let's face it. Let's face it. Early 18th century. Yes, early 18th century of an evening. You don't have much to do. When it's dark.
Contemplate.
When it's dark, you can read a book. And apart from going out to the opera or the theatre sometimes, that's it.
Or discuss.
Yeah. Whereas, of course, the 20th century, I think diversions, which are lovely in moderation, then get a bit ridiculous in terms of, the attention span starts to drop. And then, of course, once television kicks in, then and that's actually really interesting. Since the 1960s, you look at political polemic, and it collapses really very quickly in terms of the attention span.
Do you actually know the maths on it?
I don't.
What went from to? I was Googling this. I didn't go back to the 1800s, but I was looking at the decrease of attention span since, I think, the early 2000s to now. And I was reading one report that said it's gone from about 7 seconds to about 1.3 seconds for a Gen Z.
Really? That's horrific.
Yeah.
That is horrific.
It's crazy. That's less than a goldfish. It's 3 times less than a goldfish, quite literally.
Yeah. But yes, you look at it, but it's all the more stark when you look at as I said, the early 18th century, where they write assuming you have leisure to think about their argument. And then it's
interesting. Now we're fighting, the Instagram's fighting and TikTok's fighting to win your attention in a millisecond. Yeah. And we're wondering why we can't focus on our goal.
Whereas French Revolution, you had Thomas Paine writing about rights of man, or common sense during the Revolution, then writing about the rights of man. And then you have Edmund Burke writing his response, which is Reflections on the Revolution in France. And these are substantial books. And the point is, everyone who was interested in debate bought both, and read both. And the sophistication of thought is extraordinary. And so you come out of it, and, okay, I think I have a handle not only on the French Revolution, but I can put it in the context of the wider philosophy. And and I'd have to decide for myself where I position myself in this debate. But you end up with this much wider worldview as a consequence of reading 2 books. Yeah. And it just, you don't do that anymore. It's just these sound bites.
Yeah. And then algorithms that are, ensuring whatever you currently believe is just being reinforced again and again. I definitely don't think there's enough awareness of the damaging effect of having your existing belief systems consistently reinforced with no challenge.
Yeah. It's in fact, it's one of these really interesting periods of the history. One of the really interesting periods is the American Revolution, but another one is actually the English Civil War, where you end up with this crucible of political thought, and you end up with phenomenally very modern propositions. And you read them and you think, oh, yeah, this is contemporary. And then you go, well, hang on, this is 1650. The people are saying this. So,
what were some of the leading ideologies or hypotheses for?
Well, just concepts about, for example, democratic representation. And they're really interesting debates over and the American Revolution was actually a reworking of the same thing, whether you get consent to the governed with individuals, or whether you get consent to the government with, provided the interests of the community to whom the representative belongs. how do you effectively achieve government?
So this is what they were asking.
Yeah. And then how, given that you have some people with a strategic view, to what extent do you hand over government to people with a strategic view, given that the consent of the government could be lost because, frankly, lots of people may not like where things are going, and they're going, yeah, you might be terribly clever, but we just don't want to go there. And these are ongoing issues even now, obviously.
100%.
And it's just fascinating. You look at debates along the Civil War, and they're saying, well, we should probably be rerunning some of these debates now.
Yeah, and actually extending the thought rather than pointing ourselves in a merry-go-round of the same questions without any extension of thinking.
Yeah, well, I mean, step one is to be aware of what has been debated before, because that's one of the things that we're missing now. I mean, William Gibson, the cyberpunk author, said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Yeah.
And that's been true for centuries. And in fact, one of the really interesting things, I think, is to go back through the debates of the last 300-400 years and realize how much of the future was embedded there hundreds of years ago.
Conversations. Yeah. And yet we're at this, point now where I always say history doesn't repeat, it echoes.
Yeah, well, who was it, Mark Twain or someone who said, and history may not repeat itself, but it certainly likes a rhyme.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Interestingly, on my grandma's side and my dad's side, so my dad's mom is the Walpole line. So that.
Really?
Yeah.
Mr. Robert Walpole.
Yeah.
Fascinating man.
Yeah.
Really fascinating man. I read a lot. I did a lot of research on him when I was over in Oxford. Really interesting.
The scoundrel. The genius of the scoundrel.
Yes, he was a bit of both, but then he had to be at the time, if he were.
He's a great example, I think, of what we're talking about.
Yeah, he's
the Tower of London for 6 months there at one point.
Yeah, well, he's a bit of a pirate. Interestingly enough, the phrase prime minister was coined for him.
And he was the first.
But he was the first, but it was actually meant to be a rude term. Because before that, the ministers were loyal to the crown, but not to one another. And they were all regarded as essentially co-equal.
Yeah.
And it was just force of personality as to who would dominate. Whereas, of course, Walpole actually sets himself up and says, no, I'm running the cabinet.
That's right.
And so, either you toe the line with me or you're out. And so the term prime minister was coined by his enemies.
The prime.
Yes, to say this is something that the English constitution's never seen before. This is a prime minister. It's like a vizier. And actually,
a lasting legacy.
Yeah. But it's funny because, of course, after Walpole dies, and then the idea of the prime minister recedes for a while, and then Pitt the Younger in 1805 or thereabouts becomes prime minister, and it's a case of, well, actually, it's a good concept. So then it gets revived as a title without any of the original odium. Yeah, mind you can thank Walpole partly for the American Revolution because he refused to tax the American colonies.
Yeah, right.
And when he was asked, well, why? Because England got taxed, and so it's a case of, well, why aren't you taxing the American colonies? And he burst out laughing and said, well, I have half of old England already against me. Do you think I want all of England against me as well?
I mean, there's an intelligence to that thinking.
Oh, there is. But it's classic Walpole. He's brilliant, but somewhat unscrupulous. And that's fine for the era. But then, of course, when you are trying to wind that back, and that's one of the interesting things with the American Revolution, you're trying to wind it back and trying to tax the colonies. And even Benjamin Franklin admits at the time that there's nothing unreasonable about taxing the colonies, but it's inherently. But it's a case of, well,
don't quite like it.
Don't like it. Don't want it. Yeah.
And so, your career as a political writer, how long did that last, and how did that so what you're doing today? That seems like a bit of a ship change.
Oh, yeah, but I guess I'm interested in ideas. I'm interested, and ultimately, I think political writing is about the human condition.
100%.
And it's about why do people think the way they do? How is it they think the way they do? I mean, what makes politics distinct from economics? I think the late 20th century lost touch with that completely, with this weird belief that politics is somehow a subset of economics, which of course it isn't.
Yeah.
And So I was doing my doctorate in mathematics when I decided to become a political writer as a bit of light relief. And
what a sentence.
And so they continued in parallel, really, across the 90s. And then I concentrated on AI since 99. And I ran off and became an analyst in climate change for a few years in Canberra.
What was your conclusion?
Controversial. I tend to think almost everyone who talks about climate change don't understand where we are. I'm profoundly pessimistic about aspects of climate change. I tend to think we are going over that particular waterfall already, and people who talk about net zero, etc., abatement to escape climate change kind of miss the point that was a conversation to be had 30 years ago. Whereas I think that is no longer a conversation unless there's some radically good geoengineering that comes around. And if it does, great, let's reopen that conversation. But
are you ambitious about that?
I think it's possible. I'm hopeful. But I think it's folly to assume the geoengineering solution is going to come along. Particularly when you get a number of countries such as Russia that have a strong self-interest not to allow geoengineering. Because what we would regard as catastrophic climate change actually for some countries represents an opportunity. And so I think we all assume a unanimity, which isn't really there. And so it's, again, the politics of climate change are really, really interesting. But yeah, so I tend to be fairly pessimistic about climate change, but at the same time, obviously, then there's huge challenges. But I tend to think climate change, it's a bit like Battle of France moving into the Battle of Britain, in that Dowding, who was the Air Chief Marshal of the RAF, really clever man, really interesting man. He was crunching the numbers when no one else really was. And so while the Battle of France was still going, Dowding sat down and did the numbers and basically said, yeah, Battle of France is lost.
Why are we still battling?
Why are we still doing this? Because it's not feasible anymore. And the point is, if we throw all our resources at the Battle of France, we have no resources if we lose the Battle of France. And so then what do we do for what became the Battle of Britain? And so he wrote a famous letter to Churchill, just saying, we have got to stop sending Spitfires over because if we lose in France, then we lose everything. And arguably, you could say the same to climate change, because abatement and adaptation are very, very different. Every fiscal dollar you spend on abatement is a fiscal dollar you cannot spend on adaptation. And so if abatement is the Battle of France and adaptation is the Battle of Britain, there comes a point when you say, all right, we've spent enough on abatement. We're not going to succeed there, so let's move on.
How much did the Australian government invest in potential technologies that aren't actually here and now?
Oh, I mean, the interesting thing, I was in the Australian Greenhouse Office doing the Howard era, the Gorgon project for geosequestration. Massive. But the Howard government was remarkably bad at communicating what it was doing in climate change. And and then we moved on to Rudd/Gillard when I was still in what was then the Department of Climate Change. And then that was a very different approach where they concentrated on economic solutions. But anyway, and some of those economic solutions were far more controversial. They should have been more controversial. They should have been questioned far more.
Just the ignorance of people around the subject.
I think partly that, partly people didn't want to question. This is again when we're getting into the saying, for example, a carbon tax. What are the actual assumptions underpinning a carbon tax? And of course, the biggest elephant in the room is, all right, if the momentum of the climate system becomes too great and we go over that particular waterfall, then all carbon markets inherently collapse permanently. Because they can no longer achieve anything. And so it's a case then you have to go a bit upstream and say, all right, at what point do we say this is no longer a clever idea?
Yeah.
And we have to look at alternatives. And that's something that it's a conversation no one seems to be really having at the moment. And I hasten to add, this is not someone who's a, quote, skeptical about climate change. It's a case of you say climate change is very real, it's very dangerous, but it's a far more complex topic than people seem to acknowledge.
Yeah. That's the sign of serious.
What's that?
That's the sign of serious.
Yes, it is. It really is.
1999, this is when you began your journey in AI.
No, I began my journey in AI actually in 1990 itself. But actually 89 when I did a master's.
To paint the landscape of what the thinking around AI was back then.
Yeah, so nothing worked. So this is the so-called winter of AI. There'd been a whole lot of optimism in the 1980s, so-called expert systems, none of which really worked terribly well. And so in the 1990s, you had the so-called winter of AI. You had neural networks, which didn't work very well. You had a number of other techniques, which didn't work very well. I was really lucky in that I belonged by accident more than anything else. I was studying mathematics at the University of Queensland, and there was a chap there, Jan Skronsky, who was simultaneously at the University of Queensland and the University of Southern California. I've never worked out how he managed to do that. But he belonged to an international clique of eminent, mainly elderly mathematicians and physicists, and they wanted to do AI, but they wanted to do something new because nothing worked very well. See above.
What was their motivation? What utility did they?
They wanted to make industrial robots work better, and not an abstraction of an industrial robot, but a real physical robot.
For safety, for
safety, for effectiveness. Because of course the thing is, these big industrial robots, and having programmed them from time to time, they're enormous. They're heavy. You don't realize just how heavy they are until you actually program them. It's huge. And so you've got an eighth of a ton moving around at speed, and it has lots of gears. And of course, engineers in the 80s and 90s loved to linearize everything, but an industrial robot is inherently nonlinear. It's an inherently complex object. It has lots of lubricants, which, if they overheat, change their properties in awkward ways. And it's a really interesting thing because it selectively wears and tears when you have pick and place 24/7. It's a big robot arm just working assembly line all the time. It suffers wear and tear, but it's a little bit here, a little bit there. Cog here has its teeth slightly worn, cog there. Stepper motor loses power. And so each robot arm becomes idiosyncratic. And so what these guys wanted to do was a really sophisticated bit of AI. They wanted each robot arm effectively to be aware of itself and aware of the other robot arms in its workspace, and to coordinate accordingly. And so as each robot arm became worn, it needed to become aware that its overall dynamics were changing and compensate accordingly so that you have it.
So this is what they were trying to achieve in the 90s?
Yeah, in the early 90s. And really like ridiculously sophisticated. And the point is you have multiple robot arms in the same workspace. Which of course they don't tend to do at the moment. They tend to keep them nice and far apart. And that's how you solve the problem by not solving it. You just quit through everyone. So all the robots are safely in their own little space. Because what these guys did was say, no, we want them all working together in the same space.
Yeah, to achieve cohesion.
Yeah. And so they said, well, none of the existing AI works terribly well, so let's design something different.
So there was AI back then?
Oh, yeah. They didn't call it. I mean, you would have some people talking about AI, but the serious practitioners were talking about it as nonlinear control and adaptive control and so on.
Yeah, but it had an awareness itself.
It needed to, yeah.
Interesting.
And so you would have model-based adaptive control, for example. And so these guys worked on that, and they said, nothing currently in space works, so throw it all out and let's do something different. And the solution they sketched out was almost there, but not quite. It worked locally, and we actually tried it out in a robot arm, and it showed the beginnings of working.
Okay.
Which is all very exciting. And then this team, and it was led by Emeritus Professor George Lightman from Berkeley. And George, bless him, he's still alive. He's in his late 90s now. Wow. George is the control theory of what Stephen Hawking was to black holes. He's the greatest living control theorist in the world. Wow. And the chap I was working under, Jan Skoronsky, and there was a chap over at University of Paris, Austin Blaquier, and there are a few others. And I was doing my doctorates actually in what we would now call adversarial AI. So as well as playing around with robots, I was doing stuff with air combat. And so again, adversarial AI is much older than people think it is, because people talk about generative adversarial networks and imagine this all took off in 2014. I did a doctoral thesis on adversarial processes.
Was the course you say the military that was...
It was
that technology.
It was concentrated. Well, I mean, there's a military application because, again, it was a case of I thought fairly obvious, and again, wearing the political hat, things were going to go horribly unstuck. So we see the end of the Cold War, happy days. But whilst everyone else was saying, "Hurrah, peace in our time," I tended to take a more gloomy perspective and say, no, it just means that the problems are different. And sure enough, one of the huge problems of the 90s was you had all these sort of second-tier countries that had scary, scary weapons that had previously been held in check by the US and Soviet Union. And then when the Cold War ended, suddenly all these scary, scary little countries, they went, oh, actually, now we've got all these weapons ourselves.
Yeah.
Let's play with those. But also you use things like air combat mathematically as a really interesting just test bed. Because it's non-linearity, there's conflict, there are objectives, etc. Anyway, so I was working on this, and
as an engineer,
and as a mathematician,
right?
As a mathematician. Mathematicians and engineers look at the world in fundamentally different ways.
Yeah.
And so we give each other a hard time. So engineers think incrementally. It's actually an important distinction. Engineers think incrementally because they always need to build something that works. Whereas mathematicians are far more heavily driven by aesthetics because the quote cheats, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That's all I know and all I need to know.
Yeah,
but to be sure. And to give an example of difference. The Spitfire was designed by Mitchell in the late 1930s, thinking, he was technically an engineer, but he was thinking like a mathematician. He said, I want to build something beautiful. Because when you're a mathematician, if it's beautiful, it's almost certainly right. If it's ugly, it's probably wrong at a cognitive level mathematically. And so engineers and mathematicians approach things in just an essentially different way. And it really irritates engineers when they say, solve this problem. And you say, no, it's ugly, go away. Because then you go off and sit under a tree and say, well, why is it ugly? How do I make it better? So anyway, so these guys were working on industrial robots and autonomy. And it was almost there, but not quite. And then the team fell apart. George effectively retired. Both Jan Skoronsky and Austin Blaquier died. And I was one of the few people standing in Australia who had been some disciples of Jan Skoronsky. Almost all the others probably got snapped up by defense. And
so surprising.
Yeah, and so I was sort of going, well, no, I want to do my own thing.
Not selling my soul.
Yeah, well, I want to work on problems that I found interesting. Yeah. And industrial robots, no one was interested in fixing that as a problem in the 90s. And so I said, well, actually, this maps remarkably well to chronic disease. So an industrial robot struggling with the way it's changing over time and having to become aware of what it's doing and adaptively changing how it's doing, what it's doing, is very much like someone with a chronic disease, modifying medication, particularly medication with a tight therapeutic window so that it achieves adequate control. So they sound completely different, but they're remarkably
sort of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, they're essentially isomorphic problems. And so I started doing that. And Parkinson's disease was the first application I worked on.
Did you just have a personal interest in health, or that's where you felt you could make a difference?
Well, that's where I felt I could make a difference.
Yeah.
And I felt, and again, it's an intuitive thing, I felt that I was close to shifting things.
Yeah.
And it's not quite there yet, but, I was lucky in my family through their resources behind me, which was great. We tried Parkinson's disease first, but it didn't work for a number of technical reasons. I did some defense work as well.
What would have the ultimate outcome of that have been?
For Parkinson's?
Yeah.
Trying to transform dyskinesia. So people are dosed with a drug called levodopa, and after a while with levodopa therapy, they take uncontrollably a phenomenon known as dyskinesia. And the conventional view is dyskinesia is caused by the disease itself. My view is that no, it isn't. It's caused by the drug-disease interface.
Yeah.
And so I thought and still think there are ways of reversing dyskinesia intelligently. But there were too many problems with that. And then I tried some defense work, and I came to the realization that computing was not sufficiently powerful. So I could not get access to the sort of computers I needed to actually prove this stuff. So I ran off and did climate change from 2005 to 2011. And then by 2011, I was no longer optimistic about climate change. And I basically said, well, absent some pretty impressive interventions, we're heading for another Permian extinction. So let's hope something gets sorted out there. But then I went back, while I was doing that, a very good friend of mine, Jenny Gunton, who we were at prison uni together in the 80s, early 90s, and we used to drink noxious cocktails. And she came back from the US where she'd been doing her postdoc. And when I explained the situation, she looked at me as if I was an idiot. And this winding back a little bit, this is 2007 when I was going, I want to do something different. And she looked at me and said, why don't you do diabetes? Because type 1 diabetes, we know the mechanisms and you have lots of data available to you. So surely you can try out your stuff there. And so from 2007 to now, I've been working in AI. Now I stayed in climate change because I was still waiting for the computers to get good enough to actually deploy this stuff. And then sure enough, I kept putting a toe out of the water. And then 2011, 2012, we got some funding from JDRF in New York. And then I demonstrated that the tech was now, it's still not, at that stage, still not great, but it was adequate to build a prototype.
Okay.
And so then did that, and then working on increasingly sophisticated forms of AI and not using neural networks at all.
And it's generalized AI to sort of shape how AI looks as we move forward. What's your...
Well, instead of I wouldn't use the phrase generalized AI because that means something very specific. But
that's ironic.
What's that? Yes, it's a very ironic phrase. It actually means something really specific. But I looked at AI completely differently from neural networks. Everyone's obsessed with neural networks. Voltaire had a phrase, had a saying: "If it's true that God created man in His own image, man has certainly returned the compliment." And something analogous could be said about AI. We seem determined to build AI that looks like a human brain. And I have never understood why that's a good idea.
So just spend a couple of minutes deconstructing that.
Right.
The sort of the thinking behind why maybe people see that as the only way, and then your differing ideas.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's partly an engineering mindset of incremental improvement. So you've got to start off with something that you know things.
This is new baseline.
Yeah. And it's like, well, the human brain evidently thinks. It's composed of neurons. So if we're going to build AI, let's build it based on simulated neurons and then move forward. Whereas, I've always been interested by things like Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, where Lovelock argues that, Earth is a cognitive substrate. It's like, you can have ecosystem.
Simulation.
What's that?
It's basically just a simulation.
Yeah, well, you will get onto that a little bit later on, but yeah, you can say that the ecosystems represent a computing substrate, and one of the interesting things. So people in the 90s were playing around with evolutionary algorithms as a form of machine learning, and again, this is an ancient idea, dates back to the late 1950s of trying to use evolution, harness the mechanisms of evolution to form a machine learning process. I would argue strenuously that one reason why evolutionary algorithms have never really succeeded is because certainly in the 80s and 90s onwards to now, Richard Dawkins' worldview on evolution has been a dominant one. And so evolutionary algorithms all resemble, it's very much within the Dawkins worldview of what evolution ought to look like. Whereas, and this ties in with your comment about simulation, if you say, well, perhaps Dawkins is wrong, massively, and evolution it operates differently from how Dawkins thinks it operates, and so there are other elements to it. So maybe the landscape, for example, is not simply something to be survived. What if the landscape is actually part of the algorithm?
Is it not?
Right?
Is it not?
Oh, it is. I argue it is. But of course, the traditional Darwinian view of evolution insists the landscape is something we survive. Yeah. Well, I would argue that the landscape itself is part of the algorithm. And again, you then get into all sorts of arguments about teleology and the existence of purpose and evolution and so on and so forth. But if you approach it in a different way, you suddenly get an outcome that works. And this is the fun thing about my work, is that it scales. And so a lot of the problems from the 1990s. So what happened with AI 1990s to now is that nothing worked in the winter of AI in the 90s. Then Geoffrey Hinton, through some massive insights, managed to solve some of the problems with neural networks. And so now neural networks have become the gold standard upon architecture upon which everything else is built. And evolutionary processes still stagnated. Whereas now I've solved the problems that caused the stagnation. So even as we speak, I'm also doing work with engines, aviation engines. And at the moment, as we speak, a very noisy high-performance computer is currently evolving computational models of aviation engines as if they're living organisms.
Interesting.
And it works. And anyway, and in parallel, so engines, just as I said, industrial robots and chronic disease therapies in medicine were isomorphic. Aviation engines are also isomorphic to the same problem.
Interesting.
And so it means by changing how we think about evolution, we've solved the key problems that were holding back evolutionary algorithms as a basis for machine learning. And so, for example, I was in the IBM Watson AI X Prize. Our team, our Queensland team, was one of the 10 semi-finalists in the world in 2020.
Amazing.
And we were the only team from outside North America and Europe/Israel to be one of the 10 semi-finalists. We demonstrated a form of generative AI. We've got explainable AI. We've been in stealth mode. So this is part of us breaking out of stealth mode, is me talking to you now.
Thank you for choosing on.
And so we demonstrated that out of a history of failure, out of a medical history of complete failure, our form of adversarial AI is able to design new insulin strategies that appear to be safe and stable. And we're about to do a clinical study demonstrating this in a Westfield hospital.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, so organ scale personalized medicine and new enhanced insulin strategies for people with highly unstable type 1 diabetes based on an AI inspired by evolutionary ecosystems.
Wow. So let's go a little bit deeper into what constitutes the way that you're designing AI. The the ecosystem approach to AI?
So this is for dynamical systems. So this is for systems that change in a structured way. So think of disease progression in the human body. Think of drug interventions on diseases in the human body. Think of, for other examples, aviation engines, which are slowly degrading over time, or industrial robots that are degrading over time. So you have a set of equations that you know in theory you can write algebraic equations. So this is what the system must be doing. But the numbers, what we call the parameters of the system, are very, very difficult to measure, or sometimes impossible to measure.
Yeah.
Some of what we call the state variables, so aspects, attributes of the system that are changing over time in a structured way, only some of them are able to be measured and some aren't. And so what we do is we have what we call a trinity. And partly it was to tease Richard Dawkins, and partly because the matrix movies have carried yes. So we have our fundamental computational unit has algebraic equations. It has the parameters expressed as chromosomes, genes on chromosome, a simulated chromosome. And then we have the geometry of trajectories in state space. And so
does that provide a more infinite landscape of trajectory that it can predict?
Well, it provides the basis. It provides a granular object with which an AI can think in a way that it can explain to the user, but more importantly, in a way that it can explain to itself.
Yeah, fascinating.
And so if you don't know what the parameter values are in your chromosome, you start off guessing. And probably a good way of talking about it is the aviation engine work. So we did a demonstration a couple of years ago, and again, we're just coming out of stealth with that now, in that you've got an aviation engine you're trying to understand. So this is an extremely complicated object. The digital twin is, let's say, 121 dimensions. That's a basic engine. It operates under very high temperatures and pressures. And so you don't know what any of the parameters are. There are over 600 parameters of the state variables. State variables, things like temperature and pressure. Most of them you can't measure. So like the combustion chamber, you can't measure anything in the combustion chamber because it's just too hot. But the laws of thermodynamics are obeyed. So you can write equations. You could say, well, there's fluid dynamics, there's thermodynamics. Even in the combustion chamber, you know what's coming in, you know what's going out. Massive high temperatures inside, but everything is structured there too. And so you can write equations for all this. Then, first generation, you don't know what any of the numbers are, so you guess. And so you have this very long chromosomes of guessed numbers. And then you try to make this engine. And of course, everything explodes in microseconds, because if you randomly choose numbers, it's not going to work.
Yeah. But can you see if it's getting closer?
Some candidates of engines survive a bit longer than others. And so those candidates are attractive to other candidates. They breed. Second generation, boom, everything explodes. Oh, I really want to animate this because it looks hilarious. And then, but some things survive a bit longer, and so on and so forth. And so you get this evolutionary process happening. And bizarre but true, it gradually evolves an engine that resembles the original engine. And the point is, then this is why you need high performance computing. Because you need to throw this massively parallel architecture. It gradually evolves a digital twin of the engine such that you end up having convergence between your digital twin and the real engine. And then the point is you can then say, all right, well, something weird's happening in the real engine. I can't dig into the combustion chamber because it's too hot, but I can look at my digital twin and say, all right, what must be happening in there?
Okay, so you can save machines for a lot longer.
Yeah. And now this whole thing still applies, and to make this work, I mean, so you have these models, these trinities evolving. You have predation. So you have predators that come along and go, all right, that one looks tasty. It's like the simulation.
Wow.
You have predator prey.
Where is that? How is that a part of the expression?
It's really interesting, and philosophically, the implications are mind-blowing. So
the law is ever present regardless of the
So they're going, okay, predation is a really interesting phenomenon. What if it's not just survival of the fittest?
Well, every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Well, what if part of the point of predation is to encourage emergent properties? So think of the lions in the savannah, trying to eat wildebeest, say. Survival of the fittest would suggest that the lions eat the unfit wildebeest. And so the fit ones survive. But that's not really what happens. I mean, there's one dimension to what happens. But what else happens is...
muscle.
Yeah, well, the lions go for the young, fit wildebeest. Because who doesn't like veal? So then what happens is emergent behavior. The wildebeest herd forms behavior to protect the young. And so they don't just leave the young off to do their own thing. The wildebeest survive are the ones that have a strong maternal instinct. And so the mothers protect their young, and the bulls get all garrulous and protective of everyone. And this is an emergent structure that protects the wildebeest against the predators. So the predators aren't just doing survival of the fittest, they're actually encouraging the emergence of new structures. Which, yes, it ties into survival of the fittest again, but it's a whole more than that. It's more than that.
It could also be argued that the instinct or the intelligence to do that is a component of how the fittest is defined.
It can, but then that's my point, is that and the way to think of it, the way a maths geek thinks of it, is you get a vector, and one component of the vector is classical survival of the fittest. But the other component is something else.
With a twist.
And the way that the two combine is then what happens. And so then the interesting question is, all right, so what's this other direction? What does that do? What does that mean? And that's what a lot of my research has been about.
Fascinating.
And back in the medical space, it's been really interesting. So, for example, we didn't tell the AI to look for pulsatile insulin in the blood. So in real human bodies, insulin is not this nice curve. It spikes. But no one models it like that because it doesn't tell you anything immediately useful that it spikes from a mathematical modeling viewpoint. So everyone just goes, oh, well, it's just nice smooth curve. And quite by accident, I designed the way the models interact with the AI, the evolutionary AI, so that a spiky pulsatile solution was possible. And the AI hooked on that and went, oh, this is useful. And so next thing I knew, it was there saying, well, yes, there are some nice smooth solutions, but by the way, have you thought of this? And so it was the AI suggesting solutions to me that I hadn't thought of.
Fascinating.
And it was not told to look for them, but it did. Anyway, it evolved. And similarly, one of the really interesting things we did for X Prize was we had a model of how an insulin pump works. And so then the AI it took a history of therapeutic failure, which is a medical history of someone with really unstable type 1, and using an adversarial process, it designed a much better insulin strategy. And then I said to it, and this is 2019, I said, all right, if you could redesign the insulin pump, could you improve that further? Short answer, yes, it could. And so it said, then basically, let's design something completely different. And there's a whole different approach to doing the insulin pump. So completely outside the training data. So again, this is an example of a generative AI process. And really, really interesting. So it's radically better potential outcomes. And what makes it really interesting is it all makes good physical sense. And this is the importance of fully explainable AI, which neural networks aren't. So neural networks are very much black box. Whereas this evolutionary approach it's all explainable all the way down because the AI needs to know itself what it knows.
Yeah.
And the fact it's fully explainable to humans is a lovely thing. That's a side effect.
Yeah. A good consequence.
It's a good consequence. And so it's just fascinating then when we look at this new insulin dosing strategy that it's completely sensible, but it's not how anyone does it now. And it's really, really interesting just seeing how the AI then, first of all, evolves structures and then argues with itself and to design a good outcome.
Thank you for the amazing work that you're doing.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's I'm sure as well, you know, there can be so many other applications of how this predicts and supports and, you know, allows for new solutions.
Yeah.
To emerge, yeah.
Yes, so there's a lot of different applications in both medicine and engineering. So it's a really interesting tool, and it's fun too. It's a case of you know, we're literally evolving stuff inside a high-performance computer, and we have predators, we have prey, we have complex vertebrate behavior, and it's just a lot of fun. But yeah, useful outcomes, which of course is an important part of all this. But philosophically, it's then kind of disturbing too, because
well, we can never really be free of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but would we want to be? You know, because it's also allows us to understand ourselves.
Well, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
But I think I can honestly ask you 1,000 more questions, and maybe we have a part two. But yeah, I think what a profound insight into the way that this universe is designed by nature.
And that's an interesting thing. The way you said that is designed by nature. So. So this is one of this is the key issue where I parted company from Dawkins' worldview, in that Dawkins openly rejects any suggestion of underlying structure. It's very bold, and I think he's wrong.
Yeah.
So then he argues basically the anthropic principle that
he was an atheist, no doubt.
Oh, militantly.
I think they're actually the closest to God. Resisting the heart.
No, I wouldn't agree with that one, but I think atheism is itself.
At some point, that rubber band's going to have to snap.
I think atheism is itself a form of religion. And I like Huxley, who was a very close friend of Darwin's, who, and I don't have the quote precisely right, I'm ashamed to say, but he said he is the chap who coined the term agnostic. And he said, to me, it is not a lesser thing, rather than saying God created the universe. You know, God created the universe to create itself. And in all this, you don't have to define who or what God is. Yeah, that's not relevant. That can remain the great mystery. It's not relevant. But the point is, there is underlying structure. And I guess the fundamental place where I part company with Dawkins is that I said there's underlying structure. So let's try and understand that and see where it takes us. And where it's taken us is new forms of evolutionary AI.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
I've loved this conversation.
No pleasure.
Yeah, all of the journeys that we've just been on this past hour. How can our community support the work you're doing? How can we engage more intimately with this amazing work?
Well, I mean, we're collaborating for DNA, so to do it good and great. So for the diabetes work, we're collaborating for that. I'm coming out. My team. We're coming out of stealth mode this year, which is all very exciting. Yeah. And so there'll be some extra opportunities when we come out of stealth mode.
Fantastic. What's the best way to follow that journey?
Well, we've been using LinkedIn, but that's not really a good mechanism for these.
We can put those links down.
Sorry,
we will drop those links down.
Oh yeah. So if you look at my profile, that's what we've been doing. But EMI, actually, the best way, don't follow me, follow EMI, Evolving Machine Intelligence. So it has a page on LinkedIn which it's nascent, so it hasn't doing anything exciting yet, but it's about to get exciting. Fantastic. So that's probably the best place to track what we're doing.
Okay, so we'll definitely be sharing those links below. Wow, any last thoughts to leave us with?
No, well, AI is very different to how you think it is. I think artificial intelligence in the 23rd century is going to go in very different directions from how people currently think it will go.
Okay, and do you believe that will be, this is my final question, far more utopian or?
No. I do not know, but ultimately, I don't think technology itself can be utopian. I think the humans, ultimately AI is it's just another tool. It's like any other tool. Ultimately, the humans have to decide whether or not it's going to have positive or negative outcomes. So we can't use AI to escape our own responsibilities.
That's a great final message. Nigel, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening, my friend. If you enjoyed the show, please let us know by leaving a review or sharing the episode with someone you love and expanding this conversation as far and wide as possible. If you're looking for a community to have conversations with about global affairs, please jump in our Telegram group or join our free think tanks. Thanks for being a part of the shift towards a love